Now to some startling new details about former President Donald Trump's alleged criminal scheme to stay in power after losing the 2020 election, and some new reporting on what he might do if he loses again in November. In a court filing unsealed yesterday, special counsel Jack Smith argued the former president, quote, resorted to crimes as he sought to remain in power. Federal trial attorney Robin Nunn joins us now to talk about this.
Yeah, I think this was a very interesting brief. To your point, I'm not sure that there were entirely surprises that came forth, but it is a very lengthy 165-page document, many of which are things that we already knew about. And I don't think a lot of us expected to see this sort of private criminal scheme coming back into emphasis last night.
Okay, so what just happened in federal court is absolutely massive, and I need everyone to stop what they are doing and understand the full significance of what we are witnessing right now, because this could be one of the most important and consequential developments in any of the legal cases against President Trump that we have seen in years and possibly ever. A federal judge has just unsealed over 300 pages of documents that were supposed to stay hidden from the public and sealed away until trial. Documents that reveal in devastating and specific detail what Trump and his inner circle actually knew about the 2020 election fraud claims before they went out and told the American people over and over again that the election had been stolen from them. And let me tell you, what these documents show is not good for Trump. Not good at all. In fact, this might be the most damaging evidence release we have seen in any of his cases to date. And that is really saying something given everything else that has come out recently. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video. These are internal emails and witness statements and financial records and private communications that paint a crystal clear picture of a president and his team who absolutely 100% knew beyond any reasonable doubt that the fraud claims they were making publicly were completely false, but they pushed them anyway, and pressured state officials anyway, and organized the whole alternate elector scheme anyway, that led directly to what happened on January 6th at the United States Capitol when a mob of his supporters attacked the building and tried to stop the certification of the election. Federal Judge Marianne Keller made the decision to unseal these extremely sensitive evidence files on November 13th, and the contents have been coming out over the past several days as journalists and legal analysts pour through the 300-plus pages, and every single new revelation seems worse than the last for Trump and his increasingly desperate defense team trying to keep him out of prison. We are talking about 300 pages of material that prosecutors have been using behind the scenes to build their case against the former and current president.
On former President Trump's response to this filing in the Jack Smith case, walk us through what he is saying, and is there any concern among Republicans, Republican allies, that this could basically backfire on the former president? Because, boy, he's spending a lot of time talking about how the 2020 election was rigged, and we know that Republicans are saying, let's look forward, let's focus on 2024, not those baseless claims.
Yeah, Kristen, I think at this point, for the Trump campaign, at least their perspective on it is that your views on the 2020 election are pretty well baked in at this point.
But that the public was never supposed to see until the actual trial began and evidence was presented in open court. And now it is all out there for everyone to read and analyze and draw their own conclusions from. Now everyone can see exactly what Trump's own advisors and lawyers and campaign officials were telling him in private behind closed doors, while he was simultaneously going on television and holding rallies and tweeting to tens of millions of people that the election had been stolen from him and from them, and that they needed to fight like hell to take their country back from the people who had supposedly cheated them out of their rightful victory. The documents span from November 2020, right after the election results came in, through January 2021, when the Capitol was attacked by that violent mob, and they include emails between Trump's most senior and trusted advisors discussing the fraud claims and internal memos that were circulated within the campaign, laying out what the evidence actually showed, and grand jury testimony from witnesses who were inside the room when the key decisions were being made about how to proceed. This is not secondhand information or speculation from anonymous sources, or what some journalist claims happened behind closed doors, based on people who were not actually there. This is the actual paper trail and the receipts, as people like to say these days. that shows definitively and undeniably what was really going on inside Trump world during those critical weeks when American democracy itself was hanging by a thread and could have gone either way. And what the documents show in devastating detail is that Trump was repeatedly warned by people he trusted and relied on, by his own lawyers and his own advisors and his own campaign officials who had access to the actual evidence, that the fraud claims were simply not supported by any credible evidence and would not hold up in any court of law and were going to cause serious and potentially catastrophic problems if he kept pushing them publicly. But he did not care about any of those warnings. According to what these unsealed documents reveal, he heard the warnings loud and clear from multiple people on multiple occasions, and he ignored every single one of them, and he went ahead with the plan anyway because he was not going to accept under any circumstances that he had lost the election fair and square, no matter what anyone told him and no matter what the actual evidence showed about what really happened. The immediate reaction to this unsealing has been intense and dramatic on all sides of the political spectrum. Trump's defense team is clearly scrambling behind the scenes to deal with the fallout and figure out how to spin or explain away documents that seem to directly and explicitly contradict the core arguments they have been making for years about what Trump knew and when he knew it, and what his intent was when he took the actions he took. Members of Congress, particularly Democrats, but also some Republicans who have been critical of Trump's conduct, are demanding accountability and increased scrutiny of everything that happened, and some are even calling for his immediate arrest based on what these documents reveal about his state of mind and his criminal intent during that dangerous period when democracy itself hung in the balance. All right, let us dig into the details of what these unsealed documents actually contain, because the specifics are absolutely crucial for understanding why this is such a devastating and potentially case-ending development for Trump and his legal defense, and why people on both sides of the political aisle are treating this as such an enormously important moment in the ongoing saga of accountability for January 6th. The documents that Judge Mary Ann Keller unsealed span the entire period from November 2020, immediately after the election results became clear, through January 2021, when the Capitol attack occurred, and they include several different categories of evidence that prosecutors have been relying on behind the scenes to build their case against Trump for election interference and conspiracy, and related federal charges that could send him to prison for years. First, and perhaps most damaging, there are the internal emails between Trump's top advisors and senior campaign officials discussing the fraud claims in real time and debating the legal strategy for challenging the election results through the courts and through other means. These emails show conversations happening as the situation was actively unfolding in real time. Advisors sharing information with each other about what the actual evidence showed versus what Trump wanted to claim publicly to his supporters and to the American people, and expressing serious concerns about the dangerous direction things were heading and the potential legal exposure everyone involved might face down the road. According to detailed reports about the contents of these emails from people who have reviewed them, multiple senior advisors told Trump directly and unambiguously in language that could not be misunderstood that the fraud claims he wanted to make were simply not supported by any credible evidence whatsoever and would not survive even basic legal scrutiny in any court in the country, no matter how sympathetic the judge might be. They warned him explicitly and repeatedly that pursuing these false claims publicly could backfire badly on everyone involved and could expose him and them and the entire campaign operation to serious criminal legal liability down the road when investigators started looking into what happened and who knew what and when they knew it. Second, there are internal memos that were circulated within the campaign and within the White House itself during this critical period, laying out in detail the legal arguments and the underlying evidence, or more accurately, the complete and total lack of evidence, for the various fraud theories that Trump was promoting on television and on social media, and at his rallies to crowds of supporters who believed every word he said. These memos apparently show in black and white that the campaign's own lawyers and legal advisors had thoroughly investigated many of the specific fraud claims Trump was making publicly about voting machines being rigged and dead people voting, and mysterious ballot dumps appearing in the middle of the night, and all the rest of the theories that were circulating at the time, and had concluded definitively that the claims were either completely false or wildly exaggerated beyond any reasonable interpretation of the facts, or based on fundamental misunderstandings of how the voting and counting process actually works in practice. The memos document what appears to be a systematic and professional effort to evaluate the fraud claims using actual evidence and facts, and a systematic and unavoidable conclusion that the claims simply did not hold up to any kind of serious scrutiny. Third, there are witness statements and grand jury testimony from people who were physically inside the room when key decisions were being made during this period, and who can testify directly about what they saw and heard with their own eyes and ears. These witnesses describe conversations they personally had with Trump directly, or conversations they personally witnessed between Trump and his advisors, where the question of whether the fraud claims were actually true and supported by evidence was explicitly discussed in detail. According to these witness accounts, which were given under oath with penalties for perjury, Trump was told on multiple separate occasions by multiple different people that the claims were not supported by any credible evidence, but he insisted on pushing forward with them anyway, because he believed, or at least claimed to believe, that the election had been stolen from him regardless of what the actual evidence showed. Fourth, and potentially very significant for additional charges, there are financial records that show in detail how money was being raised from supporters and how it was being spent during this period using the fraud claims as the primary justification and motivation for donations. Prosecutors have apparently been building a case that Trump and his team raised hundreds of millions of dollars from ordinary supporters by telling them over and over that the election had been stolen and that the money was desperately needed to fight the fraud in court and save American democracy, even though they knew internally from their own investigations that the fraud claims were not legitimate and would not succeed. If that is what the evidence actually shows, it could support additional serious charges related to wire fraud and fundraising deception and conspiracy to defraud donors on top of the election interference charges that are already pending. The picture that emerges from all of these documents taken together as a comprehensive whole is absolutely damning for Trump's defense strategy on multiple different levels simultaneously. His primary legal argument throughout this entire process has been that he genuinely and sincerely believed the election was stolen from him based on information he was receiving from advisors and lawyers who told him there was real evidence of widespread fraud. He has claimed repeatedly that he was acting in good faith on that professional advice, and that even if he was ultimately wrong about the fraud and the election was actually legitimate, he was not acting with criminal intent because he sincerely believed in his heart that what he was saying was true. But these documents appear to show conclusively that Trump was receiving very different advice in private than what he was claiming to believe publicly. His own people, his own trusted advisors and lawyers and campaign officials were telling him behind closed doors that the fraud claims were false or at the very least completely unsupported by any credible evidence, while he was simultaneously going on television and posting on social media and speaking at rallies telling millions of Americans that the election had definitely been stolen and that they needed to fight to take their country back. That fundamental disconnect between what he knew privately and what he stated publicly is potentially devastating for Trump's defense because it goes directly and unavoidably to the question of criminal intent. Criminal charges related to election interference and fraud and conspiracy typically require prosecutors to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant knew or should have known that what they were doing was wrong or illegal at the time they did it. If Trump genuinely and sincerely believed the election was stolen based on good faith reliance on advice he was receiving, then his actions to challenge the results might be seen as misguided or even reckless, but not necessarily criminal in nature. But if he actually knew the fraud claims were false because his own people were telling him so and he pushed them anyway purely for political purposes to stay in power, then his intent looks completely different and much more clearly culpable under federal criminal law. All right, let us break this down into the key points you absolutely need to understand about what this unsealing means and why it matters so much for Trump's legal situation and for the broader political landscape heading into the next phase of this ongoing and escalating drama that seems to produce new developments every single week. Point number 1. A federal judge has unsealed over 300 pages of previously secret and sealed evidence in Trump's federal election interference case, including internal emails between senior advisors and witness statements from people in the room, and financial records showing how money was raised and spent, and private communications that span from November 2020 immediately after the election through January 2021 when the Capitol was attacked. This is an enormous amount of material that was supposed to stay completely hidden from public view until the actual trial began, and its release fundamentally changes everything about the public understanding of what was really happening inside Trump world during those critical and dangerous weeks. The documents are not speculation or secondhand accounts from anonymous sources. They are the actual paper trail showing in black and white what Trump's own advisors and lawyers were telling him in private while he was making very different and contradictory claims to the American people in public. Point number 2, the documents show clearly and explicitly that Trump was repeatedly warned by his own advisors and his own lawyers that the election fraud claims were simply not supported by any credible evidence and would not hold up in any court, but he pushed them anyway and proceeded with plans like the alternate elector scheme despite those clear and repeated warnings from people he trusted. This is absolutely devastating for Trump's legal defense because his primary argument throughout this entire process has been that he genuinely and sincerely believed the election was stolen based on professional advice he was receiving from people around him. If the documents show he was actually receiving very different advice in private, advice that the claims were completely false and unsupported, then his criminal intent looks very different and much more culpable from a legal standpoint. You simply cannot claim good faith reliance on professional advice when the actual advice you were receiving behind closed doors directly contradicted what you were telling the public you believed. Point number 3. The unsealed evidence includes grand jury testimony from witnesses who were physically inside the room when key decisions were being made and who describe under oath specific conversations where Trump was explicitly told by multiple people that the fraud claims were not legitimate and not supported by evidence. Grand jury testimony is particularly significant and powerful because witnesses testify under oath with serious criminal penalties for perjury if they lie, and the testimony is typically very detailed and specific about exactly what was said by whom and when it was said and who else was present to hear it. Having multiple independent witnesses describe multiple separate occasions where Trump was directly warned about the fraud claims being false and chose to proceed anyway, despite those warnings, creates a powerful and difficult to overcome evidentiary record. Point number 4. The financial records included in the unsealed documents apparently show that Trump's team raised enormous sums of money, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, from ordinary supporters using fraud claims they knew internally were not supported by any credible evidence. This could expose Trump to additional serious legal liability well beyond the election interference charges, because raising money from people based on claims you know to be false is itself potentially criminal wire fraud and fundraising fraud. The combination of election interference and fundraising fraud based on the exact same false claims creates a powerful and compelling narrative of a president who was willing to systematically deceive the American people and take their hard-earned money to fund efforts he knew were based entirely on lies. Point number 5. The political reaction to this unsealing has been immediate and intense, with members of Congress demanding accountability and some calling for Trump's arrest based on what the documents reveal about his knowledge and his intent. This puts additional pressure on prosecutors to move forward aggressively with the case without further delay, and puts significant pressure on Republican members of Congress to either defend Trump in the face of this overwhelming documentary evidence or distance themselves from him heading into the next election cycle when voters will be paying close attention. So where does this leave Trump, and what happens next as this explosive and damaging evidence makes its way into the public consciousness and into the ongoing legal proceedings that will determine whether a president goes to prison? Well, Trump's defense team has a very serious and potentially insurmountable problem on their hands right now. Their entire legal strategy has been built around the core argument that Trump genuinely believed the election was stolen and was acting in good faith to challenge what he sincerely saw as a fraudulent and illegitimate result that denied him his rightful victory. But these documents appear to show definitively that he was being told internally and repeatedly by his own trusted people that the claims were simply not true, that his own advisors and lawyers were warning him over and over that the fraud allegations were not supported by any credible evidence, and he proceeded with making those claims publicly anyway, despite knowing they were false. That fundamentally undermines and destroys the good faith defense and leaves the defense team scrambling desperately for an alternative explanation that will be credible and persuasive to a jury. They could try to argue that the documents are being taken out of context or misinterpreted, or that the advisors who warned Trump were themselves wrong, and he had good reason to disbelieve them and rely on other advisors who told him what he wanted to hear instead. They could try to argue that merely receiving warnings is not the same as actually knowing something is false, and that Trump was entitled to make his own judgment about conflicting advice. But those arguments are going to be extraordinarily difficult to make convincingly when the documentary record is this extensive and this consistent across multiple sources in showing that Trump was warned repeatedly by multiple people over multiple weeks and chose deliberately to ignore every single one of those warnings. The political implications are equally significant and far-reaching. Trump has maintained strong support among Republican voters in part because many of them genuinely believe his narrative about the stolen election. But if these documents show definitively that even Trump's own team did not believe the fraud claims, that they were telling him privately the claims were false while he was telling his supporters the exact opposite, that could shake the faith of at least some supporters who have been giving him the benefit of the doubt all this time. Keep watching this story very closely because the fallout from this unprecedented unsealing is just beginning and the consequences could reshape everything.